Welcome to Ecclesia Principles, a biblical strategy for believers to engage in God's design for government with Ray Eppard.
Glad to have you back again today. Ecclesia Principles. We talked yesterday about that the word ecclesia that Jesus spoke in Matthew 16, verse 18. And I also say unto you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will build my ecclesia. That word ecclesia, the meaning that it had the day that Jesus spoke it, was that it was the legislative assembly for the Greek city-states. Now, it also had the meaning that because the Romans, they as they came to power, they adopted that concept, and then they tweaked it and changed it a little bit. But it was still that same basic concept. Ecclesia, as we saw from Merriam-Webster, was a political assembly of citizens of the ancient Greek city-states. YourDictionary.com said it was the public assembly of Athens. That's where it started. You see, Jesus could have, when he was speaking, he could have said, "You're Peter, and on this rock I'll build my temple. On this rock I'll build my synagogue." You see, if Jesus was trying to identify a gathering for worship and teaching, or even a religious site, he could have used one of those words. But to me, it was really odd as I began to study the word ecclesia, that Jesus, here talking to these Jewish believers, he goes out into the Greek-Roman world and pulls in a term to identify something he's going to build. On this rock I will build my ecclesia. I'm sure that had to be strange and somewhat odd. I'm sure that the Pharisees and Sadducees probably didn't like it once they heard it. That what's wrong with the synagogue? What's wrong with the temple? And you see, most of our mentality today has to do with that Jesus is just trying to build an assembly of people to worship. Now, that is a part of what he's wanting to do. He told the lady in John chapter 4, he said, "The day is coming, the hour now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for he seeks such." God does want a group of worshipers. There is a place for it. There's a part of that. We'll get into that more as we look at ecclesia principles more in depth. But you see, the thing of it is, all of our thinking has been, that's what he's trying to do. You see, we have to be willing to admit that right now the culture is impacting the church more than the church is impacting the culture. The church, we're not being collectively, we're not being salt. We're not preserving the society. We're not preserving the moral fabric. We're not preserving the functions. We can't look at the world and go, "Oh yeah, Jesus told us to pray. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." We are getting there. No, we can see it getting further away. We can see it getting further away. But Jesus said this ecclesia, gates of hell would not prevail against it. This group of people, and again, in the big picture of things, the ecclesia is God's group of people, Jesus' group of people that are going to impact the culture. Now, obviously, part of how we impact the culture is winning people to Jesus as their Lord and Savior, and they become believers, they become followers. But also, there is more to be done. We've got to not only be light, we've got to be salt. We've got to be salt. Now, let's talk a little bit about how the Romans instituted the ecclesia. Once they defeated the Greeks and they took over the known world, the Romans adopted the ecclesia concept. Now, if you would, see, most of the time, people don't think that Jesus interacted with government. They think he was totally removed. He just interacted with religious people. Well, that's partly true. You see, the way the Romans did it, their term, rather than being ecclesia, their term was Sanhedrin. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be getting ready to share with you, for a point of reference, the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds. The Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds can give you this information. You check it out. Because I know a lot of what I'm saying is different than what you've heard. And you don't need to believe it because I'm telling you. You need to dig into it for yourself to determine for yourself, what does the Lord require of you? And then you go from there. But in this, the Bible Backgrounds talks about how the Romans used the term Sanhedrin. We're familiar with the Sanhedrin in Israel, that Jesus was taken before them in his trial. But even the Roman Senate in Rome was dubbed a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a term for a ruling council. Now, if you would, just to kind of correlate it to our modern society, our world, our country, the Romans had at least 3 levels, very much like us. We have federal, state, and local governments. The Romans, very similar in nature. Our governmental system was somewhat patterned after the Roman structure. Caesar and the Roman Senate in Rome constituted the federal government. And of course, once the Caesars became the emperors in full power and so forth, then they by themselves were the federal government from that standpoint. But then you have what would equate to the state government or territorial government. 2 of the main characters that we see in the Gospels that correlate to that position would be Herod the Tetrarch, King Herod, his descendant, then also, going back to the crucifixion of Jesus, Pontius Pilate. Each one of them had their territories, because if you'll remember, when they brought Jesus to Pilate, because Pilate, his jurisdiction was over Jerusalem and other parts of Israel, but when he heard that Jesus was from Judea, he sent him to Herod. Herod had that part of the country and additional territory. They were both, if you would, on that middle level. They weren't at the federal level. They were appointed. They were that medium. They were there to oversee it. They were over the local government. Now, the local governments had their own Sanhedrin, the ruling council. Their ideal number was somewhere around 70, typically 71. Not that they had that at all times, but the Sanhedrin would be made up of local people. People of influence, people of power. In other words, many of them would be the wealthy, the landowners, the business owners. A term from the Old Testament, and this is what would fit into Israel. They would be the elders of the people, the leaders of families, significant families, the leaders of the tribe. You must look in the Old Testament, and they would appoint 12, like the 12 spies. They got one from each family. There was an appointee from that. That Sanhedrin was made up in a similar nature to that. Since Israel was a religious nation, a nation based on faith, then the priests, specifically the chief priests, but then other priests, other doctors of the law, were all a part of this Sanhedrin. They were a part of that council, if you would. And that was the Roman equivalent at that time of the ecclesia. They determined things. Now, part of what we miss in all of this is that Jesus, because so many of the Sanhedrin were of a religious nature, their role and function in society was of religious nature. We only see the religious aspect, but they were also there in their official government capacity, because they are the people that tried Jesus. Matter of fact, when they took him to Pontius Pilate in John 18:31, Pilate told them, he said, "You judge him according to your law." He knew they were doing it out of jealousy. He said, you take care of it. And they said, no, we can't, because we can't put anyone to death. You see, they, as a local government, had the jurisdiction to implement punishment, but they could not institute the death penalty on someone. That had to be bumped up to the next higher level. They needed Pilate to do that. So they persuaded him to take the case, to hear the case, and as we know, he eventually washed his hands and said, fine. And he allowed Jesus to be crucified. But you see, it was those same people who took Jesus to Pilate, that were asking him these questions. Is it lawful to give taxes to Caesar? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Is it lawful? They kept coming back to that, because their whole thing was not just religious, but religious and political. See, when you understand ecclesia and Sanhedrin properly, then you understand that Jesus was constantly engaging the political leaders of his day, and was virtually always on the opposite side of what they were. He would say, you've heard it said, that if you give your offering to the temple, then you no longer need to honor your father and mother. See, if you would, in that sense, that those religious leaders, who were also political leaders, instituted that, Jesus spoke against it. So much of what Jesus did was contrary to the political system that was at play in Israel. And ultimately, not from God's side, but from the people in leadership, from the political system, Jesus was killed to maintain their power. Because of his popularity, they thought he would either instigate Rome against Israel, or he would gain influence and they would lose their political system. From their standpoint, Jesus was a political martyr. We know he really wasn't a martyr at all. He gave his life for us. Thank God he did. Join us again tomorrow.
You've been listening to Ecclesia Principles with Ray Eppard. Follow us on YouTube and Facebook at Liberty Justice HQ and online at libertyjusticehq.com. This program was brought to you by Victory Worship Center. Services Sunday at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock a.m. 200 Hammond Lane, Stanton, Virginia.